Hello, everyone. My name is Kyla Marshell. I'm a writer and I work at CCAP as the Development Associate, and I'm excited to introduce you all today to renowned scholar Dr. Jessica B. Harris in the hopes that she will inspire you. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Harris is a legend in the food world and a preeminent historian of African American culinary history and foodways. Because of her, we have access to a wealth of knowledge about the people and traditions that comprise African American and American cuisine at large. When you hear her bio, you'll understand why I'm so excited to talk to her today and why we wanted to bring you to her for International Women's History Month. Jessica B. Harris, considered by many to be one of the ranking authorities on the food of the African diaspora, is the author, editor, or translator of 18 books, including 12 cookbooks documenting the foodways of the African diaspora. She's a sought-after speaker and has lectured widely and written extensively for scholarly and popular publications. Harris consults internationally and conceptualized the award-winning cafeteria of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. She's currently leading the Culinary Institute of America's new African Diaspora Foodways Initiative. Dr. Harris is also lead curator for the exhibit African American Making the Nation's Table, to be presented by New York Museums of Food and Drink in 2022. Dr. Harris holds numerous awards and accolades, including an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Johnson & Wales University. In 2019, her food-related works were inducted into the James Beard Cookbook Hall of Fame, and she is the 2020 James Beard Lifetime Achievement Awardee. Dr. Harris taught at Queens College, CUNY, New York for 5 decades and is currently Professor Emerita at that institution. If you're interested in learning more about her life, you can check out her much-loved memoir, My Soul Looks Back. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for being with us today.
Goodness, Kayla, it's like, okay, time's up. We can go now. I think that's what happens when you've lived a long, and in my case, I've been very, very fortunate life. Thank you for having me. And thanks to all of you who are out there attending.
Yeah, we've got an audience of 15,000 students across 6 locations, so I'm sure they're all very excited to hear from you.
Well, I'm glad we're not able to see all of you, but I wish I could.
Yeah. So we just heard a little bit about your accomplishments as a food editor and a food historian, but I wanted to know a little bit more about your early days, where you grew up and what your upbringing was like.
Oh, well, that's kind of wonderful. I am an only child. I grew up in Queens, New York. It was called, well, Jamaica, where I was born, and then St. Albans, where I spent my years from 6 onward, pretty much. I was a full adult by the time I moved into Manhattan. My mother actually was a trained dietitian, so I grew up eating well and with very good food served. She was a wonderful cook and had an amazing palate. And what happened was, because I was an only child, when she was cooking, somebody had to keep an eye on me, so I'd be in the kitchen with her. So I grew up doing all kinds of things, and she was a very concerned mother, in that I remember the first thing I ever cooked was something that she was in the kitchen, I guess, making a pie of some sort, and she had a little ball of dough. And she gave me the ball of dough, and there was I just remember that red food coloring was involved. So there was dough and red food coloring and sugar, and we baked it along with the pie, and it came out, and we didn't know what it was. So we called it coup pie cake. It wasn't a cookie, it wasn't a pie, it wasn't cake, it was coup pie cake. So when my first cookbook, which was called Hot Stuff, came out in 1980, I think 85 or 86. My father had died by then. He never got to see my food career, but my mother was alive. And I remember writing, the first book that they send you when it's fresh off the press. And as a new author, it's like, oh my God, it's a book, it's a book. So I remember signing the first one to my mother and writing in it, "We've come a long way from kupai cake."
Mm,
So those were my early years.
that's beautiful. That's a wonderful story. Um, so how did you go from having that early relationship with food as being, what you did in the household to something that you wanted to study and engage with more deeply?
Well, there are a lot of layers that come in between that and the food study, perhaps. Because I was an only child, once again, I was very, very fortunate. I was the first non-UN related person to go to the United Nations International School, and
Mhm.
as such began to develop, I guess I wouldn't say palate, but uh, an ability and a curiosity about eating food that was outside of my own personal culture, so that I had Indian food, I had Polish food, I had British food and well cooked British food, not the stuff people like to joke about. I
Mhm.
had, Chinese food. And that was all in the 1950s. So this was, before we were saying pasta, we were calling it spaghetti. Before we were doing a lot of the things. One of the things for people your age that's sometimes difficult to think about, and even the students probably even more so, is imagine the United States when there wasn't arugula everywhere.
Mm.
Imagine United States when lettuce was iceberg, and when a frankfurter was some kind of mixture of mystery meats, pork, beef, what have you, but there weren't chicken or turkey hot dogs, there was no turkey bacon, this was a very different culinary America. And so to be eating, and we'd have international suppers and they'd play games. So we'd be eating noodles or eating what was spaghetti with chopsticks. And it was like, but now we understand something about the history of noodles. So it wasn't that far off. We would be doing all sorts of things like that. So that was a way to grow my culinary curiosity, if you will.
Mhm.
Then flash forward multiple years. One of my side hustles, if you will, for my full-time job, I have been varying degrees of professor, instructor, well, instructor, lecturer, all the way up to full professor at the same institution over the period of 50, that is 50 years. So my culinary career has always been a parallel career. It was what I did with my spare time. It was what I did on my days off. It was what I did, in those little spaces that you find in your life. So that gradually from journalism, I started writing about food. I was in the late 1970s the travel editor for Essence magazine. And there I began to morph between doing a straight column, I went, I saw, I this, to doing something that we called the Go Gourmet. So it was, I came, I saw, I ate this, which was a very different thing. And I have taken to saying, and I'm sure that the Bourdain estate is going to reach out and tap me on my shoulder one day, but I've been saying to the world, I was writing about food and culture when Anthony Bourdain was probably still in shorts. So, because it goes back to the 1970s. And so I was writing about food and culture. Flash forward several more years, I started to work on my doctoral dissertation. And my doctoral dissertation is actually on the French speaking theater of Senegal, Senegal being the westernmost country on the African continent. And so, in the course of writing that dissertation, I had to go. And so I went to Africa, to the continent for the first, well, actually, that's a lie. I went to sub Saharan Western Africa for the first time in 1972. I had many years, probably since 1968, been familiar with Morocco. I didn't go often, but I went maybe 2 or 3 times before I went to West Africa. But the whole idea then of finding things that were at the same time unknown and familiar really came to the forefront when I went to West Africa for the first time. And so I was there. I happened to speak fluent French. My undergraduate major was French. And
Mhm.
so I could communicate with people. And I was there before there were lots and lots of African Americans. And so I was able to find people who were just open. I mean, it continued, but I mean, as more people came, there were more people to talk to. But I was like, oh, we want to tell you, we want to share this. And so I got to meet folks, I got to see folks, I got to dine in people's houses
Mhm.
because there is a Senegalese notion of something that is called teranga. It's called teranga in Wolof, it's called diarama in Malinke, and it is hospitality. It is welcome. Um, just interesting parenthesis. Miss Manners, who
Mhm.
is, you're familiar with Miss Manners, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so she is an etiquette columnist for multiple newspapers, or was, wrote a book called Star Spangled Manners. And in that book, which I quote in my book, High on the Hog, she says, I don't say this, she says this, so I'm paraphrasing Miss Manners, that the whole notion of Southern hospitality is not from Europe. It is probably from the African continent.
Mhm.
She doesn't even say probably, she simply straight out states it is from the Africans. It is something that came along with the okra, along with the watermelon, along with the field peas, along with the sorghum, along with the millet, along with all of those things that came from Africa, the continent, including coffee, by the way, to
Mhm.
the United States. So that for her to say that talks about how important manners and how important hospitality was. So, having benefited from that hospitality, having learned a little bit about Senegalese food, and having had that proverbial light bulb, what I think Ms. Winfrey calls the aha moment,
Mhm.
happen, it was about the connections between the food of that place, Senegal specifically, and the food of my childhood, my youth, my grandmother's. On
Mhm.
that very first trip, my mother went with me, and that was wonderful because she was also a connector in that way. And we went not only to Senegal but to the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, and then to Benin. And
Mhm.
so, in all of those places, which we now know are places that were crucial places. We also went to Ghana. We saw different types of African food from West African food, but we also saw connections. So that's a very long answer to a very short question.
No, that gives us a really great idea of how you came to this line of work, and I think it kind of echoes what the diaspora is, which is that it is dispersed. It's many different people and places and things. Um, so what has it been like for you over the years uncovering all of these kinds of lost stories and lost histories of that cuisine and of the people who contributed to it?
Well, it's been great fun. I went to an all girls college, very sort of la di da school called Bryn Mawr, that was wonderful. It's outside of Philadelphia. And when I went, the lady who was then president, I remember her being formidable to say the least, but came across the stage in the theater on the very first day of class, and giving the lecture to the incoming students and their parents. And she said, when people get out of Bryn Mawr, they will be able to write about anything. And she was right, because what I came out of that school and then the subsequent schools that I went to all the way through the doctorate was with an ability to research. And so when I applied that ability to food, what happened was I was able to then take a different kind of eye to things, take a different kind of way with things. My first cookbook was called Hot Stuff. and it was about food made with peppers and chilies from around the world. And I knew something was up when, or people thought that something was up when the first thing that I did was not start with recipe, but I bought well, I went to the library for some of them. I got Columbus's diaries, I got Marco Polo's diaries, and a deep botanical text on chilies.
Mm.
And so it was very, very different from looking up the recipe for chili con carne. It was a different way of looking at food. And I certainly wasn't unique in having that way. I mean, there were people who had been doing this in Europe. There were people who had been doing variants of this in the United States, but there had not been that many people. There were some. Um, Verta Mae Grosvenor wrote about her food, but hers was rooted in the personal in some ways, and not quite in the same kind of researched intellectual pursuit thing. Um, I'm going to forget the woman's name, but she wrote a book. Helen Mendez wrote a book called The African Heritage Cookbook, and she too was talking about the African diaspora. There were several people working at it. I just came with a different kind of approach that might have been at the same point more academic, and then I came with all of that writing background as well.
Mhm. Um, so you mentioned that you started off as a journalist and then you eventually became a PhD. How did you manage that transition from journalist to doing something like being an academic and
Well,
that
remember,
level of schoolwork?
remember what I said, Kayla, which is I was always teaching. I have always been an academic. I started teaching at Queens College in 1969 and stopped teaching at Queens College in 2019. So it was a real, show enough, 50 years, a half a century.
Mhm.
That has always been there. So I became an academic through that kind of trajectory within the college, but I was always at the college.
Mhm.
The journalism may be the thing that I developed. I became a journalist simply by writing. I didn't go to J school. I don't have a master's in, narrative nonfiction or any of those things. I kind of am the prototype for on the job learning.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you have a favorite book among your many books?
Now, do you have children?
No.
Okay. Because that's like asking somebody, do you have a favorite child? If I did, I wouldn't tell you. And I actually don't. I think I'm always surprised. I mean, there's one of the things that has happened with the world of food and food history specifically is as I have gone through it, there are things that have changed. We know more about them. I mean, so that there are some things in Hot Stuff, which was published in 85 or 86, that I now know are absolutely incorrect
Mm.
because we know more, because we understand more. There are things in High on the Hog, which was as recent as 2011, which have been more deeply researched, which have changed. I mean, when I was writing about Hercules, George Washington's enslaved chef,
Mhm.
he didn't have a last name. He wasn't Hercules Posey. We now know he had a last name. We now know a great deal more about him. And I'm not going to tell you that because all of you students need to go look for that. But the point is simply um, each book is different. Sometimes I read books because I'm looking for a recipe or looking for something. It's like, I know I said that somewhere. I don't remember where, no. But in rereading, sometimes I go, "Ooh, my, mm, eek," and sometimes I go, "Well, that wasn't too bad. I kind of like the way I said that." So it all depends. But my mother used to, and I've referenced my mother a lot, but I always do. My mother used to call my books, her grandchildren,
Mm.
and until she died, every time I wrote a book, she would get it leather bound. And so I have, I think, at least 6 or 7 of my cookbooks that are bound in leather with, the titles embossed in gold and so on and so forth. She would, and when her friends would sort of tease her about, well, what about your grandchildren, Rhoda? She would say, I have wonderful grandchildren. They are all dressed in leather and they know how to sit down and behave themselves. So,
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, because it's Women's History Month, I wanted to ask you about some of the stories of women that you've uncovered in your research. Um, is there any particular woman that you've learned about that jumps out at you as being particularly dynamic or inspiring?
oh goodness, and I'm going to here be awful and forget a name. Well, there's several. Um, some of them 20th century, um, some of them 18th century. Duchess Kiamo, who was an enslaved woman in Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, became renowned for her plum cakes, as in plum the fruit, and sold enough of them that she was able to purchase her freedom, and then became known for her plum cakes throughout her vicinity. So that would be something that would be certainly a memorable woman. Um, I think perhaps some of the memorable women are unnamed. Duchess Kiamo comes to mind for me. There are many others. I think we hear about Solomon Northrop.
Mhm.
If you saw the film 12 Years a Slave, well, most people don't know that his wife was a caterer.
Mm.
And she was a renowned caterer in that upstate New York area. And so that's another woman who would predate the current era. In the current era, there are people certainly like Pigfoot Mary. And Pigfoot Mary was someone who was entrepreneurial. She came from the South North, and I'm for blanking on her real name because her real name certainly wasn't Bigfoot. And I don't think it was even Mary. But she came north, had a very minimal amount of money, if any. She found employment as a domestic worker of some sort, got herself enough money together to buy a baby carriage frame. And when I say baby carriage, I'm not talking about the little strollers, I'm talking about big baby carriages. Somehow or other, Rube Goldberg, and that's a reference nobody's going to get except somebody who's about my age, but cobbled together something, put together something that was a frame, a burner, and a pot that could go on the burner, that could go on the boil.
Mm.
And she made pig's feet. She made pig's feet, sold them on the street as a snack in Harlem, and made enough money so that she ultimately retired with, if not wealth, comfort, to California, all based on pig's feet. Okay.
Wow.
There were kala women, women who sold kala. Kala is a sort of fritter. And throughout the African Atlantic world, people of African descent were known for their ability to fry in deep oil. So the kala women would sell kala. It's a rice fritter. And in the olden days, if one was Roman Catholic, you would go to Mass, as the French would say, à jeun, without having eaten. So when people came out of Mass, they would be hungry. And so in New Orleans, there were vendors who sold coffee. One of the more famous of the coffee vendors was a lady named Rose Nicot, or, and sometimes or kala, kala being the fritter. They would have the batter for the fritter as well as a small brazier. They put the brazier down, heat the oil, fry the batter, and then you could get a hot kala and coffee in Jackson Square after Mass.
Mm.
So there were women who were valiant, who were entrepreneurial, who were extraordinary, and who used their culinary skills to better themselves, in some cases through purchasing their freedom and the freedom of others, in other cases through building empires virtually. I mean, there was a lady named Lena Richard. She's getting ready to be featured in several things at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And Lena Richard was from New Orleans. She was a television star
Mm.
in the 1950s before Julia Child.
Mhm.
Okay. I think maybe even before James Beard. She was on local television, but she was an author. She had found a way to get her cookbooks not only published, but got them into the right hands. She worked with, I think it was Father Divine being an African American sort of messianic religious figure. Um, but the books were sold. She sold vast numbers of books. She had a cooking school. She had the TV show. She did all sorts of things that we think of as being, you know, latter half of the 20th century pursuits, but she was doing them in the first half of the 20th century. So plenty of people. And of course, when you get into the latter half of the 20th century, it just explodes.
Right. Um, and then thinking of some of the contemporary women, women who are alive and working today, who are some of those people who
I
you inspire?
never do that, Kayla.
Why not?
Because I know too many of them and I will leave somebody out and then I'll be in trouble. So the best way
Okay.
to do that is to not do that. That's right
Okay.
up there with who's your favorite child. You know,
All
it's
right.
like,
I won't ask you any more
not
favorites.
not going there, not going on that one. I
Well,
love them all. Let me say that.
you're what?
I love them
You
all.
love them all. Okay, that's fair. Well, you mentioned earlier that how much food has evolved in the 20th century because we have so much more that's available and accessible. And I'm wondering, what is um, what is that the evolution that you most enjoy in terms of that widened availability of certain kinds of food or cuisine?
Oh well, I'm an omnivore. I eat pretty much everything. I have a horrible allergy, which I can confess to. I am allergic to shellfish, so I can't eat shrimp or lobster. But it seems to be more, I'm allergic to crustaceans. I can eat scallops, thank goodness. So all is not totally lost. Um, but other than that, I will try anything. It doesn't mean I'm going to like it, but it does mean I'm going to try it. And so with the trying of it, I'm just delighted that we have the array and the bounty we have. I mean, you know, I was speaking earlier about arugula and how arugula was such a revelation. I adore Mizuna. Who knew Mizuna even existed? You know, there's so much stuff. I was fortunate enough to know, I am fortunate enough to know Chef Omar Tate, who was just doing a residency up at Stone Barns. And we did a talk, and as a thank you, he sent me a box of stuff. But the kinds of things that people are making, the kinds of greens, the kinds of grains that are being used, new super grain out of West Africa that no one really knew very much about, fonio.
Mhm.
No, people hadn't heard about fonio, so we've got fonio now. We've got the Mizuno. We've got ají dulce, the flavor of a habanero without the heat. Fabulous chili,
Mhm.
used in South America. We've got all kinds of things that are just coming into our ken, coming into our knowledge that we had no idea about before. So all of this is good.
Mhm. Um, well, before we wrap up, I just want to ask you if you could offer some words of wisdom to our young future food leaders who are in the audience today.
Um, I guess the most important thing to say would be don't give up. Um, it's not easy, and it is not seamless, and um, it is not without its own fraughtness and its own problems. I mean, this sounds like it's been this wonderful, just straightforward journey, but you remember I said I taught all the way through. Why did I teach all the way through? Because teaching was paying the rent.
Mhm.
Okay, teaching was paying the rent, teaching was paying the mortgage, teaching was putting clothes on my back and food on my table. Food writing was not necessarily something that was supporting me. And I don't know how many people it's even supporting today. Most of the people that I know who are food writers have other jobs or have multiple other jobs to support their food writing.
Mhm.
I had the distinct honor of being the first black woman, to address a graduating class at the Culinary Institute of America many, many years back. And I remember standing up there and saying, well, congratulations to all of the graduates. And then my second statement was, and you were not chefs. And the graduates were most offended. The
Hmm.
faculty knew exactly what I meant, which I proceeded to explain is a chef is actually an honorific. It means you are the chef de cuisine, and chef de cuisine in French simply means the head of the kitchen. Um, People become the head of the kitchen. It's not something you get because you graduated from culinary school.
Right.
It is something that happens over a period of time, that comes with wisdom, that comes with experience, and quite frequently comes with age. So that be sure and be aware that you're in it for the long haul. It's not a 2-minute journey. It takes a while. But the thing is that in each step of the way, it offers its own rewards. I mean, in youth, there is discovery and, amazement and just all kinds of things that you learn as you go along. And that never ends. If you're really in it, it never ends. Every day I learn at least 3 or 4 new things. So it's an ongoing process. In age, hopefully you'll be able to look back and go, when I was a CCAP student, I did, and look at how stupid I was, or look at what I learned, or any variation in between that. And all of that is part of what makes it so much fun. So the bottom line is don't give up, stick to it, and you'll get there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And thank you to all the students who are watching along at home. Keep studying.
Absolutely, you'll get there.